This is Liberty Wire, where journalists, experts, and the public share their firsthand accounts of what's happening in our country. Our goal is to provide a corporate-free forum for the unrestricted freedom of speech. Hi, everybody. My name is John Carlos Frey. I am your host for Liberty Wire podcast. Today, we are speaking about the ICE raids and speaking in depth about the ICE raids. About a week ago, I read an article that was centered in the Rio Grande Valley, which is in South Texas. Think Elon Musk's Mars project, South Padre Island, where a lot of people vacation. This is the area that we're talking about. And I read an article in the Texas Observer about a raid on a bakery. So we have the reporter who wrote that article and has been on the beat for the last several years, doing immigration reporting, doing reporting about the Rio Grande Valley. And I'd like to welcome him here right now. His name is Gaige Davila. Gaige?
Hello. Thanks for having me. I'm good. Really good.
Good. Thank you for joining me and talking about this in depth. I really want people to know what's happening to the people who are being raided. I'd hate to even use that term, but the people who live in South Texas, who have businesses, who have families, who maybe don't speak English, who are pretty much running scared given what's going on. So you wrote this article about a bakery, a very popular bakery, a bakery that for the most part sells Mexican baked goods. If anybody knows what a concha is, that's the kind of food that they sell. Can you just tell me how you heard about this story and started reporting on it?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, it was hard to really ignore this story because once it did happen, it seemed like everybody on social media, whether it was local, across the state, the nation, was talking about it. And that was because there were people who were live streaming when these raids at this bakery happened. And it was, I say raids because it was two separate ones. The first one was on February 12th, where 8 employees of this bakery, which is called Abby's Bakery in Los Fresnos, Texas. It's in Cameron County. It's in the Brownsville metro area. It's close to Port Isabel and South Padre Island. About 10,000 people live there. And those 10,000 people all frequent this bakery named Abby's that's been open since about 2012. It's actually a bakery I've been going to since I was in high school too, because I grew up in neighboring Port Isabel. So to go back to the initial raid, February 12th, Homeland Security investigations came to the bakery to arrest 8 of the employees that were there. And they designated 2 of these employees as material witnesses in a harboring case that they were levying against the owners of Abby's Bakery, who at the time on February 12th were just told and asked, do you know that you have employees that are working here illegally? And according to a criminal complaint, they said, yes, we do. And the agents left, they took the employees, and the 2 owners figured that that was the end of the ordeal, only to find out, I believe it was 5 days later, HSI showed up again in the middle of a rush, and the owners were there. And HSI pulled up in numerous unmarked vehicles. It was several agents as well, some of them which were wearing masks and armed with assault rifles, and arrested the 2 owners of the bakery in front of their children, and took them and detained them and sent them to 2 separate federal detention centers under the U.S. Marshal's Office, to where they were charged with harboring illegal immigrants, to which they just recently pleaded not guilty to.
Let me ask you go back a little bit. A bakery, husband and wife owned bakery, family owned bakery, just part of sort of the local culture there. I don't understand, unless they had some priors, unless they were hardened criminals or dangerous criminals, why so many officers showed up with masks, guns drawn. This is an immigration violation. It's not a violent crime. Do you understand why this show of force?
Of course, they've never explained, to me or any other media organization that has reached out, why they would come in such a really violent manner, as if treating it as if it were really dangerous people that they were dealing with. Because you're right, it is just a husband and wife who run this bakery, and with, their employees, and it's supported by the community and has been for over a decade. There really was no explanation as to why there was a show of force, and their rationale for even levying this harboring charge against them was that because there was a separate room in this plaza where this bakery is, that apparently was covered in cardboard, showed that there was intent to try to hide people who were allegedly staying there. The owner's attorneys told me that they were free, those employees were free to come and go. 6 of those employees had B1, B2 visas, which essentially allow them to travel for extended periods of time between Mexico and the United States. And the idea that they were engaging in any sort of like smuggling or trafficking activity, which is how usually these charges are levied against people. They're usually used against people who are involved in networks of stash houses and transfers of people between borders and between people and coyotes. This is very, very unlike those cases, which is where you usually see those kind of charges.
I'm assuming that the owners of the bakery, while they're in this rush of serving pan dulce, which in English means sweet bread, or it's a typical Mexican bakery. I'm sure they're not armed, right? They're not carrying guns. There's no reason to have the show of force. You're laughing, but usually when law enforcement does a raid or arrest someone, to have a show of force legally has to be commensurate with the threat, right? They can pull their guns and have their guns drawn and come in and say things like, come out with your hands up, only if there's a threat. If there isn't a threat, if there isn't some kind of a criminal threat or a threat of violence, they're not really allowed to go in with that show of force, because all it does, as you suggest, is it scares the population. I mean, there are probably children around, that see this show of force. Do you have a sense as to why? Or maybe as a reporter, you don't want to speculate?
No, I'm free to speculate, because it's quite apparent to me why it's happening the way that it is. And I laugh basically to try to prevent myself from getting too upset and angry about the entire ordeal. Because, right, I mean, you see some of these live streams. There was one predominant live stream on the day that the owners were arrested where there are children crying. There are people who are visibly upset at seeing these 2 people being arrested, and for the amount of police that are pulling up, and these agents sort of lackadaisically walking around looking for something to do, because clearly, these guns that they have brought and these tactical vests that they are wearing are just itching to have something be acted upon them, but unfortunately, to their disappointment, there was no reason for either of those things to be present. But really, the why is simple, is because it is just part of theatrics that the Immigration Customs Enforcement, HSI, Texas DPS, anybody involved with Operation Lone Star or with federal immigration enforcement is always trying to send messages with all of their actions, because they don't conveniently discuss any of their actions with media. They don't necessarily let local municipalities know what they are doing in any sort of way. The way that they communicate is through the imagery of dominance, through the imagery of force, through the imagery that really shows that they are sort of this, that they act at this as this. I'm trying to be measured in my response here, but it's really hard to find those words.
Well, I don't think you should be measured if you don't have to be, because you're talking about law enforcement officers, for the most part, that you're supposed to trust, right? These are individuals that can take away your civil liberties. They can put handcuffs on you. They can throw you in the back of a vehicle and take you to some kind of a jail facility. So you don't have a say. So the hope is that when they're doing something like that, they're doing it by the letter of the law. They're not doing it for some PR stunt, which is what you're suggesting. It's some kind of, we're going to have a show of force so that we want to tell you who's boss and don't try and do this again, which is probably a violation of someone's civil liberty. So go for it if you can. I mean, where are you trying to be measured?
I guess I'm trying to be measured in the sense that I want people to really understand there's no legitimacy to what they are doing in any sort of like real sense of the term. It's not necessarily done in good faith, right? It's not necessarily done because the Trump administration has a really earnest desire to try to protect the people of the United States, but rather trying to protect the dominance of the state and of the Christian nationalism of the state, to ensure that the state remains an ethno state, and that's something that I'm trying to impart on people when I say measured. I'm trying to make sure that people realize that what is happening here is not necessarily a legitimate action in terms of trying to protect the country. It's to ensure that the status quo remains exactly as it is, even if it means to take down bakery owners for doing the crime of just trying to exist.
Can I put words in your mouth by saying they would like to keep brown people from coming?
Of course. I mean, it's obvious with those actions. I mean, it's you would never see this happening at large corporations that, you know, apparently keep the country moving in the direction that it is. You don't see this happening in places where there is a large legal presence that could potentially push back against this sort of thing. This only happens in places where you know that either local leadership or the local political dynamics of an area will not only sort of apathetically let it happen, but even enable it to some degree, that there will be no pushback to what is happening there, making sure that the set of this play, of this theatric, always goes a certain way, which is why with the adage of these live streams of these raids becoming as popular as they were, one of them is viewed, you know, over 6 million times. It plays very conveniently in the hands of the state in order to show, yes, we will come after you, even if you are just a bakery owner.
I want to step back a little bit and dissect all that you've just said, because there's a lot of information I'm not sure that most of our listeners understand. You mentioned ICE as the primary force. Do you know how many agents were involved? You said a few vehicles, but how many people were actually involved to arrest 2 people?
It's hard to say, because when you try to get any information about this investigation, ICE, HSI, they won't speak to media about it. But judging from the video, you can see at least I would say between like 8 to 10 different people. There was probably more, but unless you were physically there, which of course I wasn't, it's hard to really say how many people there were. But there were multiple vehicles in the front of the bakery, and then there is an alley behind the bakery in the plaza that it is in, shopping plaza that it is in, and there were vehicles behind there too. And it seemed like much larger than the first raid that was at Abby's, which also had numerous vehicles, but comparing the 2 live streams, you can clearly tell that that second one had a much bigger presence, even though there were less people that were being arrested.
Let's just say, for the sake of argument, a dozen officers, some with guns drawn, to enter in to a private facility, a business, to arrest 2 U.S. citizens that were alleged to have committed some violation of immigration law. You mentioned ICE. Immigration Customs Enforcement is what ICE stands for. Then you also mentioned HSI. What does HSI stand for?
HSI is the Homeland Security Investigations unit of ICE, which they investigate crimes like harboring and trafficking. And so they are a little more intensive in their actions within the big umbrella of ICE, which of course is under the Homeland Security Department.
You mentioned also an operation that is underway in the state of Texas, which basically allows the governor to deputize public officials, public police officers, as federal officials, as immigration officers, right?
Yeah, it's really, again, it's essentially the laboratory for the rest of the country, for the Trump administration, to ensure that there will always be a model as to how to treat people that are attempting to lawfully seek asylum in this country, and that's, yeah, there's very little else to say about that other than it just serves as a model for what the Trump administration is currently trying to do on a nationwide scale.
Well, let me see if I can throw a little fly in your ointment here when you say there's not much left to be said. If federal officials, ICE, who are tasked with violations of immigration law. That's what they're there for. And then you also deputize a local police force, the Department of Public Safety. Public safety means that those officers are on the streets for your own public safety. But if they're always looking for a brown Spanish-speaking person, thinking that they've committed some kind of immigration violation, I'm assuming that they're suspicious just by the very nature of what somebody looks like and sounds like. So maybe they're not conducting public safety, maybe they're profiling. Does that happen?
Regarding these raids that have happened since the Trump administration could easily be attributed to profiling. I mean, people who have been U.S. citizens have been arrested in these raids. Here in the Rio Grande Valley, and even in my community of Port Isabel, you had people that were arrested and had family members question why they were arrested if they had been in the country for so long. It creates this sort of kingdom of fear in a way.
So you're suggesting that Texas local officials, the Texas state officials, DPS, is targeting primarily Latino communities when they are conducting their raids or when they're under some form of suspicion. They're not going into wealthy white neighborhoods looking for undocumented people, right? I mean, they're targeting brown neighborhoods.
I mean, yeah. I mean, where else do you see, unmarked vehicles consistently harassing people, regardless of their immigration status? I mean, you're not seeing this happening in white neighborhoods or wealthy neighborhoods here in the Rio Grande Valley or elsewhere throughout the state. You're watching this happen in places that are predominantly Latino, and it's not a coincidence. It's not a coincidence. I mean, this is the aim of the state. This is the aim of the new administration, to send that message, as ridiculous as it is and as really almost as farcical as it is, because the aims of this administration to deport as many people as possible that are undocumented in the United States is quite literally not possible from the ways that they are attempting to do so. But so long as they have the imagery to show other people and scare other people, it does sort of win that war on the human psyche and also the media war to some degree. So yeah, the targeting is always intentional, even if they don't get the amount of people that they are desiring to get, because it sort of self-imposes and wants people to self-deport in a way, which is ultimately some of the aims of this administration.
What about the spectacle? Multiple vehicles. We already talked about their show of force. What is it? What is going on when they're covering their faces in these masks, these unidentifiable, no badges, no insignia, no ICE uniforms, these undercover, cover your face? What's the point of that?
You can make several arguments for or why, you can conceal yourself or to act in, secrecy. I know certainly that HSI or other agencies that conduct similar sort of law enforcement actions in that way, whether it's related to immigration or other sorts of like violent, federally significant crimes. They can make all sorts of. Go ahead.
They're making it like a SWAT team, you mean? Like, you understand that an immigration violation, if I cross the border illegally, it's an administrative offense. It's not a violent crime. It's not a violent crime. So why am I going to approach these people that look like SWAT tactics? I'm going to throw tear gas and grenades and come in a Humvee or a tank. I mean, that's kind of what it feels like to me.
You're watching a group of people that are just inching to have some reason to use this equipment that they have gotten, millions of dollars to freely use to their discretion. Right. I mean, they have all of this money thanks to a military industrial complex, thanks to a state that spends more money on law enforcement, on militarizing areas like the Rio Grande Valley community, rather than paying for any sort of social structure or infrastructure or services. So therefore, even in situations like this, they have so much access to this material. It helps further promote the idea that this place is not only a war zone or dangerous, but it gives them something to do. As banal as that sounds, I mean, it gives them something to do with all of these shiny toys that they have. When the Trump administration the second administration first went into office, I remember driving around McAllen and seeing these large armored tank vehicles being driven by DPS officers and being the loudest vehicles on the road for no other reason other than Trump's in office. Now time to break out the toys, time to break out all of the interesting stuff that we, dare not show during the Biden administration, but now it's a free for all. It's the same thing here with making a spectacle out of arresting bakery owners, right? They have these things because it not only helps the imaging of making this area look like it's a war zone, but they quite literally have so much stuff they don't know what to do with it. That's what happens when you have a state, municipality, a county that is more dedicated to arming its police officers rather than helping its constituents.
I've been to the Rio Grande Valley numerous times. I, like you, have reported up and down the border. It's mostly rural. It's mostly poor. It's mostly brown folk. It's mostly Spanish speakers. It's mostly quiet. I don't know of it as a hotbed of criminal activity, or has something changed?
No, it's not a hotbed of criminal activity. In fact, I hardly lock my car door whenever I'm around places. I mean, here it's an extremely safe area, one that is really rich in culture and one that is also really rich in community, despite, having municipal governments that are so intent on continuing to separate said community. So yeah, ideas that this place is dangerous in any sort of fashion or is sort of on the brink of destruction or implosion because of migrants coming here is completely ridiculous. And the really sad part is the people that say those things in local office know this, but the people that they are telling that to that don't live here don't know that. As I am often confronted every time I leave the Valley and tell people where I am from, the first question is always, how can you survive down there? Or aren't you worried? And no, I'm frankly not. In fact, it's when I'm out of the Valley is when I'm more fearful for my safety.
I understand that. You grew up there, and I'm assuming that since you were a kid, it has changed as far as the ramping up of militarization goes. And in addition to all the boys with their toys that you were describing, in addition to that, there's also this media infrastructure that supports it. I know of reporters that work for Fox News and some other outlets that are now embedded with ICE, which makes it sound like some kind of military incursion. Why do you need to embed with immigration officials? The music that they play for their hits when they're talking about a story about this invasion, it's ramped up. The rhetoric is harsh. The rhetoric scares people. And I'm wondering, sort of leading to this question of, since you grew up there, what is the breaking point? What happened? What changed? It used to be this sort of quiet, rural, a whole bunch of farm workers. A lot of people don't even have electricity or indoor plumbing in some of the regions in the Rio Grande Valley. I mean, it's pretty poor. It's one of the poorest regions in the United States. And now all of a sudden, you've got media outlets, you've got the government, you've got tanks, you've got this sort of war zone. I can't figure out when it switched or when it flipped from this kind of quiet place to what it is now. Do you have a thought about that?
Yeah, I do. And I think, honestly, it's sort of like the long game that occurred with the security state trying to develop the military-industrial complex into something that sort of seeps into every facet of everyday life post 9/11. I mean, that's really how long we're talking here in terms of how this place has changed because of that militarization. We're talking about the Bush administration. We're talking about the Obama administration. It's not limited to just Trump, which I think a lot of people mistakenly think that it was all because of the Trump administration that things really started to change, which I could understand people thinking that way. But when you think about it in terms of maybe like the last 3 or 2.5 decades, where you're seeing really is just a gradual increase in police spending and federal attention towards an area that has really scapegoated a lot of what are ultimately policy issues, what are ultimately scarcity issues in the sense of capital being more important than people. So whenever I think about that question of like, when did it change? I think in some ways it's always been sort of a part of the Valley's history for it to be scapegoated, for it to be exploited, for it to be used really as some sort of politically expedient project for whoever needs it to be defined. However, you have people that are continuing to double down because they are so bought into this lie that it is migrants or the border or cartels that are making their lives more impossible, or are at direct fear of their safety, or in direct conflict with their ability to live safely. You're having this expansion of what is really just an idea that if I can only just have this one thing solved, which in the case of the GOP is ensuring that there are no migrants that cross the border, there are no more cartels that exist in Mexico, then all of these political problems will be solved, but they will only continue to exacerbate until you really do have some sort of form of societal collapse. And I really feel that this is just a prolonging of that moment, because again, there is no real political imagination or political will to actually try to solve the problems of the United States or the constituencies that very much have issues that need solving, because it is ultimately in service of corporations and ensuring that capital can always be exploited and also transferred.
Militarization is financial.
Yeah.
I mean, I would imagine that there are corporations that make the guns and the tanks and the Humvees and the surveillance equipment that are telling even the federal government that there's a war going on at the border. You need this gear, and the federal government says yes. So we're paying billions of dollars for what we're calling security. So somebody's on the take here, trying to scare us all into thinking that we need this militarization. And I'm assuming if you were to poll people, even in the Rio Grande Valley, there's a need for a border wall. There's a need for concertina wire in the river. There's a need for a dozen agents to come and arrest the owners of a bakery.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Yeah, there is obviously somebody on the take, or multiple people, but I mean, really, regardless if it was immigration, it's always going to be something else, right? I think fundamentally in American political culture and American political orientation, that war really is God for them. This is sort of the driving force of what makes the United States move. And so right now it's the US-Mexican border, right? But 10, 20 years from now, what is it going to be? This is just the latest grift for this industry, right? Even and like I keep reiterating over and over again, local officials know this, the GOP knows this, anybody that has a position of power knows this, whether it's in a capital form or a political form. The only people that don't know that are the people who do not live in this area, and people who do not really have a stake in it in any sort of form. They only know that that it is of some alleged threat to their status quo, regardless if it's a real one or not. But yeah, you're absolutely correct. It is part of the military-industrial complex, what is quickly now becoming a border-industrial complex, because it's very specific to this sort of industry and this sort of region. But it really doesn't fall far from the tree in that regard of really all of American history.
If you were to take a look at the budgets for Border Patrol and ICE, which was created in and around the Department of Homeland Security after 9/11, it always goes up. We've never solved the problem. They keep saying we need more agents, we need more officers, we need more border walls, we need more technology. But every time we up the budget and we get more of those things, the problem seems to get worse. So whatever militarization is happening along the border, it's not solving anything. I'm sure you've seen it that way as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it is sort of the old folly, right, of throwing money at a problem and just trying to, again, extend the life of not having any sort of political imagination in order to actually solve problems in whether it's a municipal, state, or federal government. Because ultimately, these things, the military, these local governments. They're really not in service to constituencies anymore. It's clearly in service to ensuring that these industries continue to survive, and that these stories, this mythos again, continues to perpetuate. I mean, it sounds, sort of like really grandiose, but when you really like examine the sort of rationale and the ideas of some of these people, you realize that it's not only very circular in its thinking, but even that circle doesn't necessarily have a real start or end point. There's really no rationale to this other than it keeps people employed, and it keeps people making money in ways that otherwise are more beneficial and easier to do for the people involved in these circles than, just trying to exist and have normal jobs. They have found themselves in positions of power that are just much too politically expedient to give up. And I really struggle with trying to see the end game here that isn't going to necessarily be a violent one, or one that where innocent people get hurt needlessly. I mean, that's already happening now, but I'm talking, of course, on a wider scale.
It will happen. It has to happen. I mean, when you militarize, that's the point. I mean, where you're not having people who are helping children go over a crosswalk. You're having people with guns and tanks, and you're militarizing a place to cause some form of harm, not for protection. Anyway, what I want to know from your reporting in the Texas Observer, and we will link to that article as well as showing some of the video that you were referring to, some of the Facebook posts of the raids themselves. So if you're listening to the podcast, just go to our YouTube channel and you'll be able to watch what Gaige has been talking about here. I want to know what we've been talking about, what it does to the actual community, what it did to the bakery, what it did to the owners of the bakery, and maybe even some of their customers or their families, and the shockwaves that something like this does to the community. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, something like this, regardless, again, as I was mentioning earlier, whether or not you're the person that's targeted by an HSI investigation or ICE or any sort of like alleged federal infraction, just the very idea that you could be next, even if you have some sort of documented status, or somebody who is, or if you live with somebody who is, I mean, it's essentially, the oft-used term is a chilling effect. It prevents people from living their lives normally solely on the basis of the color of their skin, or, a piece of paper that says whether or not they're allowed to be in the United States or not. And really, it's just, frankly, their existence that is at risk. So whether it was in Port Isabel, Los Fresnos, those weeks where these raids were happening, which were, of course, after that last week in January through February and even into now to some degree, you had people that were not going outside, that were not going to these places where, ICE had been seen or HSI had been seen. In Port Isabel, I was hearing directly from people that either knew people that had been stopped by ICE or had mutual connections. And the whole rationale was, we're not going outside. We don't know what's happening, and we're not going to take the risk of potentially getting arrested. And these are people even with documented status, and sometimes even people with U.S. citizenships. This is, again, a chilling effect of just people who, again, live in these communities that are attempting to exist, doing the best they can with what they have, now suddenly being faced with a very real threat of having all of that taken away from them simply based on the color of their skin and their documented status. Specifically as it relates to Abby's, I mean, a lot of people were really, really upset in Los Fresnos. And just as equally, in a really strange way, there were a lot of people who were sort of supportive of this, or at the very least were questioning why it went down the way that it went down. But what people in these communities are looking for in this moment, and then in that previous moment, was some sort of reassurance that they could exist safely in their communities. But when you have people that come into bakeries or any sort of other place of business where every sort of person can frequent with guns or masks on to arrest, people that have been doing nothing but running a business or trying to, exist within their communities, it scares people, and they want some sort of reflection from their leaders to say, hey, I don't know what's going on here, but I'm going to get to the bottom of it. Or, hey, this is really messed up, but you're safe here. Don't interact. Here's some resources that you could use. But that's not happening here in the Rio Grande Valley because, again, of municipal governments that are taking an apathetic approach and also one that's really just revealing what some of their interests are, which are, again, not necessarily based in the safety or really the livelihood of their constituencies, but ensuring the enabling of the system to continue to move the way that it does. And I don't think anything has proved it as much as what these raids have done here locally. So the short answer is that it's a chilling effect, but it also is revealing the true nature of some of these municipal governments and local governments and what they're really serving and who they're willing to protect or enable in crisis moments like this. Because this is a crisis of morality, and it's a crisis of livelihood for the people who live here.
I imagine that a politician, a mayor, some local official in and up and down the Rio Grande Valley, if they were to speak out against the ICE raids, there would be hell to pay. You're in the state of Texas. The leadership within the state is pro-Trump, is pro-raid, is anti-immigrant. You would certainly hear from the federal government if you were to step out and speak out against the raids and defend the very people who voted for you. I'm sure that's probably what is silencing a lot of this, right?
I would assume so, but I mean, in some ways, you just have to make a decision that what's best for your constituency is probably better than whatever backlash you could face, and I think
you're talking about courage, which is lacking here.
Sure. I mean, yeah, but it's not even really my opinion so much as the opinion of people who live in these communities, right? Over and over again, I heard from people in Los Fresnos and in Port Isabel and Brownsville that they just wish that one local official would just say, like, hey, we enjoy that you are here and you make this community better regardless of your documented status. But that wasn't the case because, again, these officials, these municipal governments do not necessarily operate in service of their constituencies as much as they operate in service of the status quo. And this proved it once again. And you're right, I think, too, in saying that they would have hell to pay, figuratively from the federal government and sort of be made scapegoated again, much like Abby's was scapegoated by people who are supporting these raids nationally, because this really did turn into a national story. I mean, this video of this raid was viewed over 6 million times, right? And again, this isn't necessarily my opinion. This is what the people of these communities wanted. They wanted to hear that they would be defended by the people that they elected to be in office, and that just hasn't happened. And I, again, understand the risk that comes with speaking out, especially in this state. But more often than not, I think you would actually find a lot more support for taking that courage to do so. More often than not, that seems to be the case, rather than towing the party line.
One thing that you mentioned earlier in our conversation was about this clandestine nature of the raids itself. As a journalist, if I am investigating or writing about some kind of police action, I'm talking about municipal police, for the most part, I get a copy of the police report. I know the police officers' names who may have been involved in an arrest or some kind of an incident. I may get body cam footage. This is public information. This is all information because the state or the local police force, for the most part, is paid for by my taxpayer dollars. So part of this is the transparency and for accountability. You had mentioned that you, as a journalist, have not been able to obtain any of this information. I am under the impression that ICE and Border Patrol don't have to wear body cam. The federal government has shut the door on any sort of reporting on the specifics about the raid. Why were there a dozen agents there or more? Why did they need so much manpower? How much did it cost to do this raid? All of that information, who were the agents involved? All of that information is blacked out. Do you have any understanding about that?
No, really, in terms of rationale, no. But I mean, it speaks again to the what I was speaking a little bit about earlier about like the message comes from the action itself, right? And if people are in mass and they are taking a dominant approach to how they are conducting themselves, then very much the paper trail will be the same way. So most of the court documents are sealed in this case, and trying to get any sort of reaction or comment or clarification from ICE, especially now, it's always been difficult, but in trying to report on this story, I didn't even get a response. Most of the time, when dealing with ICE, at least in the past, I would at least get a response from some sort of press officer who would say, I'm looking into this for you, or we can't comment on this. But I didn't even get that this time around. But it speaks to the nature of this agency, that really it acts very rogue in terms of the larger scope of agencies within the federal government, that it will do this sort of action with impunity. And it is doing this with impunity, and it's shown through these court documents being sealed. It's shown by ICE not responding to reporters like myself or others who have reported on this story in the Rio Grande Valley, with even anything less than a acknowledgement of receipt. But it plays very much into what the administration is trying to convey, which is to allow the misinformation bubble to proliferate, and to also scare people, because there's such a lack of information. All of this is intentional. There's no coincidences when it comes to ICE or HSI ever.
There are also byproducts as a result of lack of accountability. They may have an agenda to sort of control the narrative here and to make sure that their agenda is seen through without any obstruction by pesky journalists like you who want to report the facts. But you're also creating a breeding ground for corruption. If there's money changing hands, if people are a little too heavy-handed, if a crime is being committed by an agent himself, or that there's a couple of bad cops in and amongst them, or they're arresting the wrong people, or whatever it may be, we're never going to find out, and they get to act with impunity. That's your role as a journalist, is to hold them accountable and to expose their ills, right? You're not able to do that.
No, I'm not. And at this point, I mean, it's hard for me to like sit here and be like, color me surprised, right? I mean, this has sort of been my interaction with ICE since I moved back here to be a journalist in 2019.
They're not going to adhere to standard federal government agreements by issuing your FOIA requests. They're not going to give information that by law they're supposed to. You have a First Amendment right as a journalist to ask these questions and to receive information. So you're basically saying they're just thumbing their nose at you now.
I mean, that's certainly what it feels like, and you're right. I mean, an oft repeated line I think about journalism, right, is that, it's the only job protected in the U.S. Constitution. It's the only one mentioned in the U.S. Constitution. But again, we're not necessarily operating with an administration, or really, frankly, a federal government that is operating within those same parameters. We're not really living in that folks theory of democracy anymore that I think a lot of people are still under the impression that we are existing in right now. But the actions of this administration, of ICE, of HSI, of targeting just these small towns that, again, of less than 10,000 people, that are seen as sort of commuter communities, but still have a very healthy base of people that want to exist where they do and are happy to live where they are, acting as if that they are expendable, and that as long as that there is a message of dominance and force to be shown, then we will expend that message. And as a reporter, it's difficult to see, but it's not necessarily surprising anymore as somebody who has worked, as a journalist in the first Trump administration and within the Biden administration, which, wasn't terribly different from that first Trump administration, and into now, where the acceleration is even further and further, to a degree where something has got to give at this point. What that exactly will be, I don't know, but I do know that it will only be innocent people that will suffer, and that the collateral damage in that respect will be just communities that I've known my entire life, and I don't necessarily see any other way past that unless something changes for the better. I just don't know what that is yet.
Does it feel like a police state in the Rio Grande Valley?
It is a police state. The United States is a police state. I mean, this is it. This is again going back to the discussions of the military-industrial complex. Again, going back to governments not necessarily serving the needs of their constituencies anymore. That's not their primary role. I like to usually think of these governments, especially local ones, as really just being growth coalitions. You know, their sole role seems to be not only enabling the status quo, but extracting and exploiting as much value from the land that is in this area as possible. And Border Patrol, federal contracts, all of those things expend value from the land and the people that live here. And so realistically, the reason why we may be seeing this apathy here, or why we're seeing an increase in the police state, is because this has become the central function of the state, regardless if it's the municipal government or if it's a state government. Things like Operation Lone Star have sort of provided that blueprint for a larger sense of what the federal government is going to do or is doing across the nation right now. So yes, it is a police state. The Rio Grande Valley is the police state, and so is the state of Texas, and so has the United States. And I don't know if it's ever not been those things, as so many people in other places in the United States for hundreds of years have written about for over and over again. You know, the only people that don't seem to understand that are the people in power, but everybody else who has been aware of these issues, who experiences them directly, understands those things. I'd be hard pressed to find anybody in the Rio Grande Valley that is aware of these issues that does not agree with me.
Are you comparing what's happening to brown folk, immigrant folk along the border where you live, to the same plight of Black people or Native Americans or other marginalized communities that don't really have a voice? Is it something like that?
I guess you could make those comparisons, but I think something that's fundamentally different here in a way that, you know, again, has some similarities, but what's different here is like obviously the age of the internet, right? And the ability to make spectacle in very instantaneous moments, and to make spectacle out of things that are not necessarily in your control, right? We talk about the live streaming of these raids, right? And while ICE is very much trying to control its messaging around, you know, its actions in the United States or in the state of Texas or in communities like in the Rio Grande Valley, ultimately things like live streams, ultimately photos, ultimately anything that shows them doing something that looks terrifying does play in their favor. And so when they create situations where people like in communities in the Rio Grande Valley are fearful for their lives or their safety or their existences, and are now undergoing plights of just, again, trying to exist and can't freely do so, that's where you can have comparisons to marginalized groups of years past, of millennia past, of centuries past. But what I think is very different about this go around is that the state has found yet another way to sort of allow people to police themselves and sort of plight themselves out of fear. And I think it's the fear that is fundamentally different in a way that because it is so easy to spread than in years past, it unfortunately allows people to sort of police themselves and police their own livelihoods and police how they are able to navigate the world in a way that is so much more immediate than in years past. I don't want to say and compare immediately what is happening here to the plights of people before, because the systemic nature of them, we haven't reached those levels yet. We haven't reached the levels to where we have like systemic extermination of people, but this is exactly how it goes. We're reaching those steps, and I wouldn't be surprised if that language is already sort of being coded out and formed, and that infrastructure being formed, you know, as we speak.
Do you have a sense if the administration and these immigration raids, the purpose of them is cruelty? The purpose of them is to cause pain, is to break the cultural spine of the region, to have people self-deport, to run so scared that they're not going to want to live there anymore or go back to Mexico, whatever it is that they're sort of pushing in this agenda. Do you find that it's working? Do you find that the administration has the upper hand and they're accomplishing their goals?
I think in some ways, yes, but I don't think ultimately it will be successful, and I really base that just on the conversations that I've had with organizers, with migrants, with people who care about these issues. Um, I think initially people were really upset and sort of defeated and jaded after years and years of having to deal with this. And I'm not going to pretend that I have these issues either, or I have solutions to these issues either. But I do know that the people that work in these spaces certainly do have ideas of how this could be resolved. But they're so burnt out that facing another few years of this with very limited funding or no funding at all, as I reported from the Reynosa, where some of these larger organizations have pulled out of some of these border communities because of loss of funding from USAID or from general burnout of people who no longer want to be having to, again, do this same thing over and over again and not see any solution to it. The GOP does not have anything else to run on because it ultimately is not an organization. This administration is not an organization that is bent on actually solving issues so much as it is to maintain the status quo. And because of that, we're not going to see solutions to that so long as they are in power, or even if Democrats are in power. I don't necessarily know if those solutions will come either, because they certainly didn't during the Biden administration, despite pleas and pleas from people who live in this community for some kind of solution from people who are intimately involved in these issues. I think people are certainly hurting from what is happening here, but I really don't think that you can keep that fight down. I really don't think you can keep the earnest sense of urgency, but also earnest sense of responsibility to human beings down, which is not what the Trump administration or ICE or any other sort of police agency has. It's a fundamental flaw in their approach to humanity, because they don't contain that. They do not understand that people here, jaded as they may be, quite literally cannot lose their faith or hope, because they have responsibility to human beings.
I'm glad that you exposed just now that the spirit of the Rio Grande Valley is a lot bigger than militarization. It's kind of what I'm hearing you say. I want to finish a conversation and thank you very much for going in depth with me on this. It's been eye-opening for me, and I'm hopeful also for the people who are watching and listening. Can you just bring me up to date of what is happening with the owners of the bakery and where the situation lies now?
Sure. So they were indicted about a week ago on a harboring charge. This was just a few days after they had been arrested, and then ultimately they had bonded out from the detention centers that they were being hosted in. And just within the last couple of days, they have pleaded not guilty. Where this case goes from here, it's probably going to drag out for a little bit. But as of now, they are pleading not guilty. The lawyers that I've spoken to for both of them both say that there is not enough evidence to convict either of them on charges of harboring, just based solely on, having a space available for employees that they had. It doesn't necessarily mean that people were living in said space, but
have people rallied in support and have started to support the bakery, or have they disappeared? I would imagine it might have hurt their business.
Whenever they reopened, I was there the day of their reopening, and I was talking to one of the people that was behind the counter, and they said that morning that they were, there was just so many people that had come to support them, that they were so happy that they were open. And I hung out there for that day for a little bit to watch as people came in and out of the bakery just as if it was any other day. And that's something that kind of struck me about being there on that reopening day, was that, had you not been in Los Fresnos, had you not been in, watching immigration news of any kind, you would think that it was just like any other day, because this is just how integral that bakery is to that community. People go there every day in the morning, afternoon, and closer to the evening in order to get their breads. And that's just how it's been since it's opened in 2012. However, when you understand the context as to why they are open and why the community is supporting them, you suddenly realize that people are there because they very much want to quietly support the community that they're in. They may not be able to vocalize like why they're doing so, but you can clearly see a community that wants to not necessarily move on from like a political way from what has happened there, but does want to move on with their lives so they don't get harassed again by a federal agency just because, again, they were simply trying to live their lives. So I would say, ironically, that this has helped their business quite a lot because people realized what they almost lost. And unfortunately, this should be sort of a warning sign to anybody else that if you have like a cultural institution in your community that is supported by people, regardless of their documented status, it could be taken away or stopped in an instant. Abby's was very lucky in this regard, but it could have very easily gone a different way. And I think people who live in Los Fresnos in the Rio Grande Valley realize that. And I hope this time around, if this were to happen to another business, that the community wouldn't let it happen so quietly, and maybe not respond to it so apathetically next time.
Thank you, Gaige. This has been a great conversation. I appreciate your time.
Thanks, John. Appreciate it.
For more information about our podcast and links to the shows, you can listen to us on libertywire.org or Facebook at Liberty Wire and YouTube at Liberty-Wire, or wherever you get your podcasts.